winter of 1883 had taken Edwin Hale in February, when the cold was still mean and the ground too hard to bury a man decently, and Margaret had waited 3 weeks for the thaw. She had spent those weeks running the ranch as she had run it every day of their 12 years together, feeding stock, breaking ice on the water troughs, mending what broke, because the alternative was sitting in the house with her hands still and her thoughts loud, and she had never been a woman who found much comfort in stillness. 3 years had passed since then. 3 calving seasons, 3 brutal Wyoming winters, 3 years of watching the feed account climb and the note balance on Edwin's old loan creep slowly downward. Milford Valley was not unkind about it. The women brought food in the early months, and the men occasionally rode over to check fences. But kindness and expectation were not the same thing, and the expectation was plain enough to read without anyone spelling it out. Margaret Hale was 41 years old. She had loved a good man and buried him. The valley had decided what came next for a woman in that position, and what came next was nothing much at all. Margaret had 300 acres on the mountain's eastern slope, a reliable spring that fed 2 good pastures, and 200 head of cattle that had survived all 3 winters through her own stubbornness and Edwin's sensible fencing. She had a barn that needed a new crossbeam, a kitchen door that stuck in the cold, and a back fence line that had shifted in the spring thaw and wanted resetting before summer. She had no hired help after the last hand had ridden off in November, and she had spent the weeks since calculating whether she could manage the calving season alone and arriving each time at an answer she did not like. Eli Crane rode up her lane on a Tuesday in April, just before noon, on a gray horse that looked like it had been ridden a good distance. He was 26, lean and sun-darkened, with a quiet in his bearing that Margaret associated with men who had done hard work and learned not to make noise about it. He took his hat off at her gate before she had come close enough to require it. That registered with her. She had picked up the rifle by the porch post the way she always did when a stranger arrived, not pointing it, simply holding it, because 3 years alone had taught her the difference between caution and fear. "My name is Eli Crane," he said. "I heard in town you might need an extra hand through calving season. I'm not looking for a permanent position. Just honest work for a fair wage." Margaret studied him from the porch. She had hired young men before who had promised full seasons and delivered half of one. The last one had lasted 11 days. Before him, a boy who had seemed capable enough until the first night birth, when she had found him sitting on a feed bucket with an expression that told her everything about how useful he was going to be. "I've had hands before who made the same promise," she said. "I can't afford another one who decides the work is harder than he expected." Eli looked at her steadily. He did not shift or look away. "I'm not going to tell you I'm different than any man who came before me," he said. "I'll tell you I'm here now and asking for a trial, and you can judge it yourself." She gave him the trial. She told herself it was purely practical, which it was, and she told herself she expected him to quit before the week was out, which she did. The trial ended on the 3rd night. Margaret had gone to the barn at 11:30 to check a first calf heifer she'd been watching since supper. The heifer was down, breathing wrong, and Margaret understood the calf was turned and that she needed 2 sets of hands. She knocked on the bunkhouse twice. Eli was awake before she finished the second knock, told him what was needed on the walk back, and he rolled his sleeves in the barn doorway without being told. He knelt beside her in the straw and asked one thing. "What do you need me to hold and where?" They worked for close to 2 hours. Margaret's arm in past the elbow more than once, the heifer laboring and frightened, Eli's hands on her flank exactly where Margaret had told him to keep them, holding the animal steady through the worst of it without shifting or asking how much longer. He did not try to take charge. He watched her face for instruction and followed it, and when the calf finally came, wet and gasping, and the heifer turned to nose at it with the fierce certainty of a creature that had nearly died and didn't know it, Eli sat back against the stall rail and said nothing. By dawn, they were both leaning against the stall, watching the calf find its legs. Margaret was covered in straw and exhausted in the deep, clean way that follows hard work done well. "You didn't try to take over," she said, too tired to be careful with it. Eli looked at the calf. "Wasn't my place," he said. "You've done this longer than I've been alive, most likely." "Not quite," Margaret said. "Close enough," he said, and smiled without looking at her, and she heard herself laugh, a real one, rusty from long disuse, and did not try to stop it. She hired him properly that morning. She did not mention the trial week. He did not mention it either. There was a chair at Margaret's kitchen table that Eli never sat in. Edwin's chair by the window, with the worn patch on the left arm where Edwin had rested his elbow every evening of their 12 years together reading by the lamp. Margaret had braced herself for the moment Eli chose it without thinking. He never did. He always took the bench along the wall, even in winter when the bench was cold and the chair was close to the stove and plainly the better seat. She remarked on it one evening in May. "You can sit there," she said. "It's only a chair." Eli looked at it. "I know it is," he said. "I figured you'd tell me plain enough when it stopped belonging to a memory. Didn't seem right for me to decide that for you." Margaret did not answer him. She thought about it long after he had gone to the bunkhouse, lying awake in the room she had shared with Edwin for 12 years, and found that she was grateful in a way she had not anticipated for a 26-year-old man young enough to have every excuse for thoughtlessness and choosing instead to wait. Spring moved into early summer, and the ranch settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned aloud. Eli fixed the crossbeam in the barn on a Tuesday in May without being asked, arriving one morning with the lumber already measured and cut. The kitchen door stopped, sticking the following week. The back fence line was reset before June, the posts sunk deeper than the originals, which Margaret noted and said nothing about. She set out his coffee before dawn each morning without deciding to, simply finding herself doing it the way she found herself humming while she kneaded bread, an old tune her mother had sung that she could not have named if asked. The coffee was there when he came in from the morning check. They talked about cattle and weather and occasionally about things that had nothing to do with either. He was not perfect at everything. He tried his hand at biscuits one afternoon when she was occupied at the barn and produced a batch that she tested by tapping one on the table edge and finding it unyielding. "You could pave a road with these," she said. "I was aiming for substantial," Eli said, and ate 2 of them without apology rather than waste the flour, which she found, against expectation, considerably more endearing than any amount of competence would have managed. His horse, a gray gelding with opinions, learned to work the latch on the paddock gate open within 2 weeks of Eli installing a new one. Margaret watched the horse let itself out on a Wednesday morning with the calm, purposeful expression of an animal that had made a plan. "Your horse is a criminal," she said. "He's resourceful," Eli said. "Those aren't always different things." He went to fix the latch a second time and came back to report that the horse watched the whole procedure from 3 feet away, with an interest that suggested it was taking notes. It was on an evening walk out to check the west fence in June that they began talking about things further from ranch business than they usually allowed themselves. "What did you want?" Eli asked, before all this. Before the ranch, before Edwin. Margaret was quiet a moment. She was not surprised by the question, she realized. She was surprised by how long it had been since anyone had asked her anything of the kind. "I wanted to see the mountains in Montana," she said. "I had a particular idea of what they looked like that was probably entirely wrong. And I wanted to spend one summer doing nothing useful, just reading and walking and not being needed." She looked out at the ridge going dark. She had not said that to anyone before. It felt strange to say it, like putting on a coat she had forgotten she owned. "What stopped you?" Eli asked. "Life got organized before I organized it myself," she said. "Not unhappily. Edwin was a good man, and this is good land. But I still haven't seen the Montana mountains, and I'm fairly sure I'll never have a summer without useful occupations." Eli was quiet for a moment, watching the last light on the ridge. "I've seen them," he said. "They're nothing like you'd imagine and considerably better." Margaret looked at him. "I grew up moving," he said. "My father died when I was 12, and my mother and I went wherever the work was after that. I've been to Montana and Colorado and Texas once." He looked down at the trail. "The moving stopped being interesting a while back. I've been looking for somewhere worth stopping." It was the most he had said about himself in 2 months, and she did not push at it, understanding that he had offered it carefully and that careful offerings deserved careful handling. "Most places you looked," she said finally, "didn't seem worth it?" "Most places," he agreed. He looked at the fence line ahead of them. "Some I hadn't looked at long enough yet to know." Neither of them said anything further about it that evening. But Margaret thought about it walking back to the house and found that the thinking did not resolve into any conclusion she could name. It settled below the level of conclusions, in the part of her that had been quiet for 3 years and had, without her noticing, begun to be less quiet. "Now, before we go further, tell me where you're listening from today. Drop it in the comments below, and if Margaret and Eli have been good company this afternoon, leave a like. It means more than you know." We're heading into the part of the story where a man with considerable patience and considerable land is about to become a considerable problem. Let's get back to Milford Valley. Hector Gaines had been watching Margaret Hale's ranch fail toward his hands for 3 years with the patience of a man who has learned that waiting is often cheaper than acting. He owned the largest operation in Milford Valley, 4,000 acres of good bottomland, and a herd that had survived the hard winters because Gaines spent money on feed where other men spent it on optimism. He was 60 years old and practical, and had made Edwin an offer on the mountain acreage that Edwin was close to accepting when a spooked horse ended that conversation permanently. Gaines had spent 3 years since treating that unfinished negotiation as a debt the land owed him. What he wanted was not complicated. The spring on Margaret's upper pasture was the only reliable water source left on the valley's eastern side after 2 drought years, and his own herd had grown past what his land could water without it. He had made Edwin an offer he believed Edwin was close to accepting when a spooked horse ended that conversation permanently. Gaines had spent 3 years treating that unfinished negotiation as a debt the land owed him. He was not, by his own accounting, a man who wanted to steal anything. He was a man who wanted to buy something at the price a failing operation ought to command. He had made Margaret 2 offers in the year after Edwin died, both polite, both well below the land's honest value, and she had refused both without much deliberation. Eli Crane's presence was a problem of the first order. A capable hand through calving season meant a ranch that might recover instead of failing on the schedule Gaines had been watching for. And seeing Margaret and Eli loading the wagon outside Farrell's Mercantile with the easy manner of people accustomed to working alongside each other, Gaines understood that the problem was larger than a capable hand. He did not move quickly. He made inquiries at the Omaha bank that held Margaret's note, quietly, through a lawyer whose discretion he had paid for before. He made an offer the bank found reasonable. By August, Hector Gaines held Margaret Hale's ranch note, and within the week had sent a letter through his lawyer claiming that the April payment had been missed and calling the full balance due within 30 days. Margaret received the letter on a Thursday. She read it twice and sat with it in her hands. Then she went to Edwin's old ledger, kept on the shelf where he had always kept it, and found the bank's payment receipt from April, dated 3 days before the deadline, in Edwin's careful hand. She brought both documents to the table and waited for Eli to come in from the evening check. He sat down and read the letter once. Then he read it again more slowly. Then he set it beside the ledger receipt and read both of them together and was quiet for a long moment. "He's claiming a missed payment that has a receipt in your hand proving it wasn't missed," Eli said. "That's what I understand," Margaret said. Eli picked up the note itself, the original document from when Edwin had arranged the loan. He read through it with the careful attention of a man reading something where the meaning lives in the exact words rather than the general sense of them. Margaret watched him. She had seen that quality of attention before, at the fence line when he was assessing a post, in the barn when he was reading an animal's condition, but it sat differently on him now, applied to paper, more practiced, like a skill he had not arrived at accidentally. The note requires 2 consecutive missed payments before acceleration is valid, he said, and it requires 30 days written notice properly served. He set the document down. This letter is dated 8 days ago. That's not 30 days. You know how to read these, Margaret said. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, My mother lost nearly everything after my father died. A man claimed my father had agreed to something not written down, and a judge found in his favor. I watched my mother's things go onto a stranger's wagon when I was 12 because there was nothing on paper to stop it. I decided that summer I was going to learn how these things worked. Sat with every contract I could find until I understood them. He looked at the note. Never wanted to watch it happen to anyone I cared for. Margaret looked at him across the table. She thought about what it meant to have learned something at 12 years old from a loss that size, and to have carried the learning for 14 years, waiting for the moment it would be useful, and to offer it now across a kitchen table as plainly as he offered everything else. She put her hand over his on the table. She did not say anything. He did not move his hand away. Between the two of us, she said finally, we might make something of this. I expect we will, Eli said. They left before dawn 2 days later, the drive to the county seat too long to manage and return in a day. Margaret had packed food the night before. Eli drove the wagon. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of Wyoming morning that made the mountains look freshly painted, the ridgelines sharp against a sky still holding some darkness in the west. They talked on the road in the way long drives produce. Margaret told him about the summer Edwin had proposed, on a fence line not unlike the ones they rode past now, without preamble, just the question. Edwin's proposal had not been eloquent and had been entirely sufficient. He told her about Montana, the summer he had spent there at 19, and how the mountains had made him understand for the first time what it felt like to be somewhere worth being. He had left anyway. At 19, he had not yet learned that finding such a place and recognizing it were different skills. If this goes wrong, Margaret said somewhere past mid-morning, you don't have to stay through what comes after. There's no obligation on you for that. Eli looked at the road ahead. I told you I was looking for somewhere worth stopping, he said. I've found it. Whether Gaines gets what he's after or doesn't, that part doesn't change. Margaret looked at the mountains to the west. She did not say what she thought, which was that no one had said anything like that to her in 3 years, and that she had not known until this moment how much she had missed being the kind of woman someone said it to. They reached the county seat by late afternoon and spent 2 days there with a lawyer named Alderton, who read through the note and the receipt and Gaines's lawyer's letter and confirmed in the careful way of a man paid to be precise that the acceleration was invalid on its face. The notice period improperly served, the claimed missed payment contradicted by the bank's own receipt, the 2 consecutive payment requirement unmet by any honest reading of the document. He'll know it, Alderton said, when I send him this. A man like Gaines doesn't make a move like this without knowing what the note says. He was testing whether you'd read it. Margaret was quiet a moment. Will he try something else? Alderton looked at her. He'll hold the note on its honest terms, because he has no legitimate reason not to. Whether he waits for a genuine missed payment is a different question. He looked at Eli. You'll want to make sure that doesn't happen. It won't, Eli said. They drove home on a clear Wyoming morning, the mountains to the west going bright gold in the early light, and what Margaret felt was not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It had to do with sitting beside a man who had read the fine print at 12 out of grief and necessity and had carried the knowledge for 14 years and offered it without making her feel she had needed it. She had been capable for 3 years, and the help, when it came, had arrived without condescension. That was not a small thing. Gaines did not trouble her publicly after Alderton's letter reached him. He held the note on its honest terms, as Alderton had predicted. The valley watched this with the practical attention of people who understood that Gaines's patience was not the same as his defeat. But the letter had been sent, and the facts were on paper now, and Hector Gaines was a man who understood what was on paper. The valley itself took longer. Margaret had felt the shift in Halcott before the trouble with the note. The knowing looks that had begun in June when she and Eli started riding in together. The conversations that paused when they entered the mercantile. She had made a decision about it without much drama. She was 41 years old and had earned the right to want what she wanted, and if Milford Valley had opinions about that, Milford Valley could keep them. It was harder in practice than it was in principle. She would have been less than honest to claim otherwise. The plainest version of it came from Dorothy Cass, who had brought soup during Edwin's last illness and whose coolness now, when their paths crossed at the feed store, registered as the specific hurt of a friendship withdrawn without explanation. And it was Nora Pilcher, her nearest neighbor, who sat beside her in church one Sunday in September and said without preamble that she had buried 2 husbands and watched this valley disapprove of her for a good many years and had found it never once fed her cattle, and that Margaret should not allow it to feed anything of hers either. Margaret held on to that. And then in October, it was Dorothy Cass who came to her door with a jar of plum preserves and an apology she had not been asked for. "I let other people's opinions organize my own," Dorothy said, standing on the porch with the jar in both hands. "That's not a thing a good friend does. I hope you'll let me correct it." Margaret took the preserves. She said that she would. She meant it entirely. By the time the first snow came, the valley had settled into something workable. Not universal approval, not the warmth that precedes gossip, but the plain, ordinary civility of a community that had decided the matter was not worth prolonged investment. It was not everything. It was sufficient. It was Eli who told her about the foreman's offer in November at the kitchen table, the wind working at the windows and the lamp turned up against the early dark. A rancher, 2 counties east, having heard of his work through calving season. His own bunkhouse, a fair wage, the kind of start a young man of 26 could reasonably want. "I won't ask you to turn it down," Margaret said. It cost her something to say it. She said it anyway. Eli looked at her across the table. "I wrote back already," he said. "I told him I'd found the place I meant to stop and it wasn't his bunkhouse." He looked at her steadily. "I told you once that staying scares me. I've decided I'd rather be scared here than safe anywhere else." He asked her in December, in the barn, stacking the last of the winter hay, the snow banked against the walls outside and their breath showing white even indoors. It was, she thought later, entirely the right place, because the barn was where they had first understood each other and where the ranch's real life happened. "I'll be 27 next month," he said, setting down the last bale and looking at her. "I didn't mention it." He paused, turning a piece of hay over in his hands. "I'm mentioning it now along with the rest of it. I know what people will say," he said. "I've known it since the day I rode up your lane. But I've spent this whole year more certain of you than I've been of anything else." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking anyway." Margaret looked at the barn around her. The stall where they had knelt together in April. The crossbeam he had replaced in May. The latch the horse had already defeated twice. She thought about the kitchen table and the contract, and the road to the county seat and the Montana mountains she had never seen. "Surely you want someone younger," she said. She did not say it to push him away. She said it because it was the honest version of the fear, and she had learned that year that honest fears, said plainly, were easier to carry than quiet ones. Eli smiled. It came the way his smiles always came, slowly, without performance. "I want someone like you," he said. "I've been fairly specific about that since about the second week of April." "Yes," she said. Before he could ask the second part of the question, before she could talk herself into anything more careful, Yes. They married in the spring on the porch Eli had finished that same week in March, wide enough deliberately for 2 chairs. The guest list was exactly the size that mattered. Nora Pilcher in the front row, Dorothy Cass beside her with the look of a woman who knew she had nearly missed something and was glad she had not. Reverend Marsh, who had buried Edwin and had apparently decided without comment that his job included celebrating what came after grief as well. Hector Gaines sent a crate of good fencing lumber the week before with no note attached, delivered by a man who said nothing and waited for no reply, and Margaret chose to accept it as the nearest thing to a concession the man was capable of, which was probably the most accurate way to understand it. Eli wore his best shirt, mended at the collar and the left cuff, and looked, Margaret thought, watching him wait for her on the porch, exactly like a man who had decided that staying was what frightened him most and had found the fear was worth facing. She had thought the same thing about herself. 3 years into a grief the valley had expected her to make permanent, and she understood, walking toward him, that they had arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, which was the most honest kind of agreement 2 people could reach. She sat in Edwin's chair for the first time that same evening, at her own invitation, and Noah sat in the chair beside it, and neither of them said anything particular about it, because it was simply the right time for the chair to be a chair again, and they both understood that without discussing it. The ranch note was paid in full the following spring, the final bank receipt arriving by post on an ordinary Wednesday morning. Margaret read it twice, and put it in Edwin's ledger beside the April receipt that had started all the trouble, and closed the ledger, and went to tell Eli, who was fixing the paddock latch for the 4th time. "Again," she said, standing in the paddock doorway. He watched the horse watching him from the fence. "He's learning faster than I'm solving it," he said. She had a tin her mother had given her before she married Edwin, a small painted tin of flower seeds from places she had never been. She had kept it on the kitchen shelf all these years, waiting for the right time, or the right place, or simply the right certainty that where she was where she meant to stay. She opened it the spring the note was paid, and planted the seeds along the south fence line, in the good soil near the water. They came up in June, bright and careless looking in the Wyoming summer light. "I don't know what half of them are," she said to Eli, standing at the fence looking at them. He stood beside her, their shoulders together in the way they stood everywhere now, without planning it. "Neither do I," he said. "But they seem to know what they're doing." That seemed right to her. She left them to it. Margaret Hale believed at 41 that what was left of her life had already been decided by what had come before it. Eli Crane believed at 26 that staying anywhere long enough to want it was only giving a place the chance to take it from you. What they built together in a calving barn at midnight, and at a kitchen table over an old contract, and on a long road to a county seat and back, taught them both something neither had quite arrived at alone. That love does not calculate ages or count winters or listen to what a valley has decided about what a person is still allowed to want, and that the bravest thing either of them ever did was not the barn, or the lawyer's office, or the church porch. It was the ordinary Tuesday in the 5th year when Eli came in for his coffee, and Margaret set it on the table, and they sat in the early light, and neither of them was anywhere else they would rather have been, and they both knew it, and neither said a word, because some things are plainest when they're quiet. "Thank you for riding with me today. I am grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding and keep writing."